do is go in and start talking about the last, if you will, aggregate that we need to go into this before we go in and start on our overall models of the economy, which hopefully we're going to be able to get to at the beginning of next week. And so let's go ahead and get started on that today. So we have, I mean, if you think about it right now, we've got, several pieces of information. We know how to go in and actually measure the output of our economy by going in and looking at the idea of gross domestic product, right? What should be and what should not be included in our national output. We now know how to go in and how to measure prices in the economy through the consumer price index, and why inflation is not a bad thing, and going in and looking at the changes in the purchasing power of our money is influenced by the average level of prices as measured by the consumer price index. So there are several big key pieces of information that we have. So the last one that we want to put in today, we can set up really nicely by going in and talking about what we call the business cycle of the economy. Now, the business cycle of the economy is nothing more than an upward and downward movements in the level of output, in the level of gross domestic product over time. So if we go in and we measure time on this axis, output, again, as measured by gross domestic product here, over time, what you're going to find is a cyclical upward and downward movements of the level of business activity. So as it turns out, when you start looking at this business cycle that we have, there are actually four different, if you will, phases or four different areas of the business cycle that we want to concentrate on. The first one is going to be what we call the peak of the cycle. So obviously that is the very highest point of output on each one of those particular cycles. All right, so those are the peaks. Now, the peaks are only important simply because that's the area where, or that's the point where we have the greatest amount of output on that particular cycle. And normally we see it in the data after it's already happened. And so what I mean by that is, if you're going in and if you're at this time period, output is increasing, it's still increasing, but it's slowing down. And then a couple of months after, you're right here, you look back and say, well, output now is actually less than what it was here. We're going to call that the peak of the business cycle. So you actually see it in the data 2 or 3 months after that peak has already occurred. All right. The other point of this simply is going to be the lowest point on any particular cycle, which is going to be the trough of the cycle. And again, the trough of the cycle is really, it's not that important other than it's just knowing where the very lowest point of that cycle actually was. And again, you see it in the data after it's already occurred. So output is going down, the economy is getting worse. You hit the trough a couple of months later, the economy starts picking up. You look back in the data and say, hey, this was the lowest point that we've seen. We're going to call that the trough of the cycle itself. All right, so that's just kind of noting the peaks and the troughs of the cycle. What we care about and what we're going to be spending the most of our time on is what happens between the peaks and the troughs. So the main area that we are going to be looking at is this one right here, known as a recession. Now, a recession in economic terms, a recession is a decline in the level of output, gross domestic product, that lasts for at least 6 months. So this is very specific, right? Because a lot of people think that just any downturn in economic output is going to be termed a recessionary period, and that's not true. So what ends up happening a lot of times is you'll see this output increasing. You'll have a little blip hit the economy, right? Output will decrease for a little while and then it will start back up again. If this decrease right here is not at least 6 months long, it is not considered a recessionary period. Now, when you're looking at recessions, there are two characteristics of a recession. Number one is that output, gross domestic product, during that period of time is in fact decreasing, right? So you're going down, right, on this curve. And thus, if output is going down, businesses are not producing and selling as many products as they normally would. Thus, they don't need as much labor to produce that output. So unemployment during that period of time is increasing. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit later. Now, in the grand scheme of things, when you go out and you start looking at how long recessions actually last in an economy, the average recession, and this is since 1940, has been 11.5 months. 11.5 months. So generally speaking, recessions are relatively short-lived compared to the other ones that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. But yet we're going to find that a lot of our discussion on how to actively manage an economy, we're going to be talking about these recessionary periods, even though they really don't last that long in the overall scheme of things. All right, so that's what we call a recession. So as we go into a recession, eventually we'll hit a trough, the very lowest point, after which economic output, gross domestic product, is going to start to pick back up. And that particular area is called an expansion. Now, an expansion does not have a specific definition to it, like a recession does. So, we don't go in and say, well, as long as economic output, increases for 6 months, then we call it an expansionary period. There's really no official definition for it. But there are two characteristics of an expansion. And one is that output during that period of time is increasing, right? So clearly from this graph right here, output over time is going up. Which also means if businesses are producing and selling more goods, they're going to need more labor to go in and do it. And so unemployment during this period of time is decreasing during an expansion. Right, hopefully getting to that target of 4%. Now, when you go in and you start looking at these expansionary periods, the ones that we have had in the past 3 decades or so have been very, very long-lived. In fact, when we got into the 1980s, set a record during the Ronald Reagan years. We had approximately 10 years of uninterrupted growth during the 1980s. Which was only, by the way, interrupted by, it was a relatively deep but not so prolonged recession in the early part of the 1990s. Once we came out of that, we had the booming 90s. And actually, we went in and set another record of 11.5 years of uninterrupted growth during the 90s. And in fact, there's really no telling how long that one would have lasted, but it turned out that 9/11 happened right in 2001. And so that really brought us to an abrupt stop. The recession of latter 2001, early 2002 simply didn't last very long because there really wasn't anything wrong with the economy. Right? That was an external shock. Kind of, it brought the airlines to a screeching halt, and thus, you couldn't get goods shipped across the country and so on. But once we got our heads wrapped around what actually happened, the economy got back on its feet very quickly in 2002. And then from 2002, well, that's wrong. From 2002 to 2008, There was another 6 years of uninterrupted growth. Again, the only reason it came to a halt was because we did have a very serious problem within the banking sector, and that's when the housing market crashed in 2008. And then that's when we went down into what we now know as the Great Recession. But then after that, we came out of that in about 2010 or so, and then we continued to grow. And give or take just a little bit, we ended up in the longest expansionary period of the United States economy, which again, the only thing that took this one out was COVID. Right. And so something that it's really not an economic problem itself, but it affected the entire economy. So you guys were going to school, your high school years during the longest economic expansion in U.S. economic history. And again, there's really no telling how long that one would have lasted if this pandemic had not have hit, because the fundamentals of the economy were looking very, very good at that time. So my point is, when you go in and you start looking at expansionary periods, they are very, very long-lived, as opposed to a year or so for the typical recession. Which will beg the question a little bit later when we start looking at our overall economic models. Why do we spend so much time looking at this when they don't occur very often and they're very short-lived, as opposed to going in and talking about something that is quite literally a decade or so long? Why do we spend so much time back here? And I think the quick answer is, when you go in and you have unemployment in the economy, even by a few percent, not just like we have right now, but even by a few percent, and people aren't working, the money isn't flowing through the economy, it hurts a lot of people very, very deeply. So it's, in my point of view, it's easy to manage the good times, right? When people have jobs, they're spending money, and everybody's happy over here, that's very, very easy to manage. What is not easy to manage is, number one, seeing these things coming right in the first place. And it's bad enough when things like the COVID hits, or a terrorist attack or something like that. When you didn't see it coming in the first place, now you got to throw everything that you can at the economy to get people back to work, to get that spending going again, and get the economy back on its feet. So again, even though that's not, these things don't happen a lot in the economy, we as economists spend a lot of time studying where they come from and what can we do about it to shorten the duration. There are a lot of people who want to spend part of their time trying to figure out a way to eliminate recessions completely. And I'm here to tell you, it is unrealistic, right? That is not a place that you want to go in and spend your time. Because what we have seen clearly over the past 30 years is that you can't see these things coming, right? Sometimes you can. Anybody should have been able to see the housing market was going to crash sometime, right? That was a bubble that was not going to, just kind of dissipate on its own, and everything was going to be hunky-dory. We should have seen that one happen. But you couldn't see the terrorist attacks. You couldn't see the pandemic. So there's a lot of external shocks that happen to the economy that you're never going to be able to get completely away from these recessions. So we're going to spend our time looking at these, and particularly trying to figure out what can we do to minimize the damage of these recessions. All right, so questions about the business cycle itself. So the last piece then that we need to add into this entire thing is right here, right? The idea of unemployment. Guys, we hear these figures a lot. They are very, very celebrated numbers when they come out every month. There's a lot of people looking at them for a number of different reasons. And I think this is one of those numbers that we hear a lot about, but it's one of the most misunderstood numbers in all of economics. So I want to spend today, and at least part of Friday, going in and talking about the idea of what unemployment actually is. Now, when you go in and say, well, what do you mean what unemployment actually is? Because if I ask you, what does unemployment mean to you? If somebody's unemployed, what does it mean?
We don't have a job.
They don't have a job. All right. Well, as it turns out, of all the things that we're going to talk about, that is the only thing that everybody that is unemployed or in the ranks of the unemployed have in common. They don't have a job. From now on, I want you to be thinking about unemployment as a measure of efficiency of the labor force, not just how many people don't have a job. It's how many people don't have a job and why don't they have a job? Because I think we're about to find out that not all unemployment is in fact created equally. All right. And in fact, you could actually break unemployment up into three different types. So the three types of unemployment. And again, we're going to find out that not all unemployment is bad for the U.S. economy. All right. So the first type of unemployment we have is what we call cyclical. So cyclical unemployment is due to a recession in the economy. Hence the term, by the way, cyclical or the business cycle. So I erased it, but when I over here where I had the two different characteristics of a recession, right? Output is going down, unemployment is going up. That type of unemployment that is happening there, that is what we call cyclical unemployment. And generally speaking, I think this is the type of unemployment that people envision when they hear the word unemployment. So in other words, they're thinking that, hey, somebody walks in, it is involuntary unemployment. So you're at work, your boss comes in and says, hey, you know what, the business isn't going so well, people aren't buying their products. We're going to send you home and we'll call you when we need you. So there's nothing you can do about it. They send you home, and so you are considered cyclically unemployed. All right, so a lot of the unemployment that we have going on right now in the United States would be termed cyclical unemployment because it is due to the COVID recession. All right, so that's the first type. The second type is frictional unemployment. Now, frictional unemployment results when people are caught between jobs or are looking for their first job. Give you a second to write that down. So it results when people are caught between jobs or they are looking for their first job. Now, generally speaking, we think of frictional unemployment as being normal turnover in the economy. I'll explain that in a moment. And generally speaking, it is a short-lived type of unemployment. Okay. So what are the different ways that you can actually be stuck in the idea of frictional unemployment? I'm actually going to go backwards on this. I gave you two reasons why within the definition itself. I'm going to take the second one first. People going out and looking for their first job. Okay, very simplified case. Let's assume you're in high school, you're over the age of 16. Right now, you're doing your schoolwork, you're doing your extracurricular activities, you're not looking for a job, you don't want a job, therefore you're not even in the labor force at this point, right? So you are not unemployed, you're simply out of the labor force itself. After you get done with high school, you go to college, you do exactly the same thing. You concentrate on your studies, you concentrate on your extracurricular activities. You don't want a job, you're not looking for a job, you're not in the labor force, thus you can't be unemployed. But then one sad day, right, you are going to walk across the stage, shake the hand of a person you've never met before in your life, and you're going to be considered an educated person, right? And you're going to take your resume and you're going to put it in the mailbox. Make that 2 days later, you got to get over your hangover first, right? And then 2 days later, you go and you put your resume in the mailbox. At that particular time, you have put yourself in the labor market because you are actively seeking employment. You're looking for a job, you do not have a job, you are not only unemployed, but you would be counted as frictionally unemployed because you are going out and looking for your first job. All right, is that a bad thing for the economy? And the answer is no, it's really not. We want to see people coming out of school, going out and looking for that first job. And what we notice is the vast majority of these people are unemployed, frictionally unemployed, for a relatively short period of time. Since they have their degree, they have skills, they will go in and they will get absorbed into the labor force relatively quickly. All right, so we like to see that actually happening. The second, oh, by the way, there's been another one of these, and this can come from a number of different places. Some are maybe shorter term, some are a little bit longer term. A longer term trend that we have been seeing over the past, probably 10 years, maybe or so. There's been a number of particularly women that have been staying home and raising the families, taking care of the kids, educating them at home, right, so on. What's ended up happening is that eventually the kids grow up, they get married, they move away, they go to college, whatever. And these women end up with that empty nest syndrome, right? All of a sudden they had everything to do all day long. Now they have nothing to do because the kids are gone. And so these women have been going out and they've been technically looking for their first job. They've never been in the labor force before. They've been home this entire time. So when they go out and they start searching for a job, they would be considered frictionally unemployed because even if they're in their 30s or 40s, they are now looking for their first job. Now, again, is that a bad thing? Studies have actually shown that these women are unemployed for an incredibly short period of time. Why? Well, if you can run a household, right, and herd the kids and do whatever you have to do, then you've got the skills that the labor force is looking for. You're at least going to show up to work, right? You're probably going to be organized in what you do and efficient and hardworking and so on. And that's exactly what the labor force is actually looking for. So what we've shown is that particular group, they would be frictionally unemployed, but they don't last there very long, right? So they get absorbed very, very quickly. All right, so anyway, that could come from a couple of different places. The second way you can be frictionally unemployed is that if you are caught between jobs. Most people have in their mind that unemployment is entirely involuntary. So what that means is somebody else unemployed you and there was nothing that you could do about it. Okay, that is not necessarily true. When you go in fact, there are a number of reasons why a person would actively quit their job, right, of their own accord and go out and start looking for another job. Why would somebody quit their job?
They don't like it.
They don't like it. And why might not they like it?
Toxic workforce.
It's a toxic workforce. That's huge today, right? If you can't get along with your coworkers or you can't get along with your boss, there's some kind of, harassment going on, something like that. People will actively quit that job without having another one to go to. Now, I think this is an important point. I have had people before say, oh, they got another job. Well, if you quit one job and automatically go to another one, you were never unemployed, were you? Right? Technically, you were never unemployed. What this is saying is you just one day quit that job and you put yourself back out into the labor force because you're not going back into that workplace again, right? And so a toxic workforce is huge. And not only toxic mentally, it could be toxic physically. Right. So in other words, if there are really bad working conditions, chemical plants, right, things like that, that could actually harm your health, people will walk out the door and say, you know what, it's not worth that. I'm going to go and try to get a job somewhere else. So it could be you can't get along with your coworkers. It could be it's physically dangerous. There are a number of reasons why a person would quit their job and then go out and put themselves back onto the labor force. Is that a bad thing? And the answer is not really. If you're going to work and you're miserable every day, and what we see these people doing is they'll quit that job and then they'll automatically go out and start very quickly looking for another one because they want to be working and they want to be making money just like everybody else does. So that sort of situation, by the way, remember when we were going in and we were talking very early on about the 4% unemployment? And I made the comment that if you have these ladders, right, which go in and represent the corporate ladder, we like to see natural movement of you up the corporate ladder or go between jobs or even go and change careers. That's a good thing in our overall economy. So we don't want to see that taken away. That's the frictional unemployment where people have that natural movement within the labor force itself. All right, so that's frictional unemployment, not necessarily a bad thing for the economy. Questions? All right. And then the third and final type of unemployment, that we have is going to be what we call, number 3 is going to be called structural unemployment. Now, structural unemployment results, from the long-term decline of certain industries in response to changes in consumer preferences or technological change. All right, there's a lot there. Results from the long-term decline of certain industries in response to changes in consumer preferences or technological change. When you're talking about structural unemployment, there is a mismatch between Wednesday, I can't spell. There's a mismatch between the jobs available and the skills of workers. This is what defines structural unemployment. I'll give you an example here in just a moment. A mismatch between the jobs that are available and the skills of the workers themselves. There can be, but not always, a mobility of skills issue. It definitely could be, but not necessarily. And again, I'll give you an example of this in a moment. Mobility of skills issue. But what is always true about structural unemployment, it is that it's long-lived and very serious. It is a long-lived and a very serious type of unemployment. All right. Anybody ever been? Yes, sir.
So not only would it include like automation getting rid of jobs, but would it also include a shift away from something like fossil fuels towards renewable resources?
That is exactly right. That is exactly what we're looking at. Yes. In fact, I'll give that example here in just a moment. Yes.
Oh, I was thinking something more like, if you're like military and coming back and you can't find a job or anything like that, because the skills you have don't match up with the skills people want.
That is also a possibility, right? They could fall into a couple of different categories depending on the skills that those people have. That is exactly right. So there are a ton of ways that you can actually fall into the structural unemployment realm, which I think that's a very good point to bring up. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I think the military in and of itself does a lot of disservice to military folks because they'll go in and they'll take them and train them to be soldiers. But if those people do not go in and do not acquire the necessary skills to do other things while they're in the military, simply having, I was in the military for 3 years, doesn't do you a whole lot of good in the labor force, right? And so I think that's a very good point to make. One of the, to go along with Kyle's thought, one of the classic cases of structural unemployment is coal miners in West Virginia. Has anybody ever been to West Virginia? No. Are you from West Virginia?
Not from Virginia.
Oh, you're from, okay, so you're around that general area in there. West Virginia and that general area is absolutely beautiful country, no doubt about it. But when you talk to people about the economic circumstances of that particular area, it's a very poor part of the country. And it turns out it wasn't always that way, because what's West Virginia known for? Coal mines, right? And in fact, back in the 60s, 70s, into the 1980s, that was one of the main industries in that particular part of the country. And going in, when you have coal mines, you have union jobs. Union jobs come with pretty high wages. So there was a lot of money that was flowing through that area of the country prior to the 1990s, let's say. What ended up happening, though, in the 1990s was the government came in and said, look, when you go in and you burn the coal that is coming out of the West Virginia mines, it is very high in what they call sulfur content. It is a dirty coal. By the way, I wish I had this sound bite. If anybody saw it from one of President Trump's speeches, he said, well, they're going in and they're cleaning the coal as we speak. Guys, coal in and of itself is a dirty business. I mean, it's just, it's a dirty product. Cleaning it doesn't mean that you're getting a clean product. What they're talking about with dirty coal is it actually has sulfur content in it. So when you burn that coal, all of that pollution goes up into the atmosphere, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And in fact, what they tried to do, because the government actually passed laws restricting the amount of emissions that could come out of these coal-fired electric plants. So what they ended up doing was to try to reduce the emissions to not get fined by the federal government, was to go in and if you were burning your coal down here, they would go in and they would insert what they called a scrubbing system, which was basically a series of filters that started out grabbing very large particles. As the smoke went up, it grabbed finer and finer particles to reduce the amount of emission that was coming out of the coal-fired plants. It worked, but it was very expensive to install, extremely expensive to maintain, and all that cost got passed on to the consumer. All right, in the form of higher electric prices. So what ended up happening though, about this same time out in Utah and the Wyoming, even up into the Montana regions, new coal resources were found that had not been known of before. And so, and it was a cleaner coal. Whatever laid that coal base down did not have the sulfur content in it that the West Virginia coal did. So electric companies changed their consumer preferences for West Virginia coal. And they started, and this is how much of a difference it made. Even a coal company in Virginia or West Virginia could buy their coal out in Utah, train it all the way across the United States, and burn it cheaper per unit than they could getting it just out of the state next to them or even in their same state. That's how expensive the scrubber system actually was. So what ended up happening was, as those consumer preferences changed, one by one, coal mines started to fold in the West Virginia area. All right. So were there still jobs available in West Virginia? The answer is yes, there was. There's plenty of jobs available, just like there is anywhere else. But the skills that the workers had of being miners did not go in and meet the jobs that were available. So those coal miners, by definition, were structurally unemployed. Now, in this particular case, there was a mobility of skills issue. Because some people would go in and say, all right, well, look, if you can't get a job mining coal in West Virginia, then pack your bags and move to Utah, right? That's where the high paying jobs are. That's good for us to say, but you have to understand the mentality of the West Virginia coal miners. If you're a coal miner in West Virginia, there's probably a chance that your dad's dad, and your dad's dad's dad were miners of coal as well. And it's not your first thought is to pack up everything and simply move across the country. So whether they wanted to or they couldn't, it doesn't matter. Those jobs did not move. The skills did not move from one particular part of the country to the other. And so what happened was some of those coal miners had been unemployed structurally for over 20 years, right? So it's long-lived and it is a very serious type of unemployment. Because think about it for a moment. If their skills do not match the jobs that are available, to get these people back in the labor force, what do you have to do to them? We have to retrain them. The problem is the vast majority of these people, they're older, right, to start, and most of them don't even have a high school education. How are you going to go in and train these people for the high-tech jobs that are going out there in the economy today? So this is one of the greatest, best examples of structural unemployment in the United States is the West Virginia coal mines. And then it gets worse, right? Because not only did the electric companies go in and start buying their coal from out west, now even the Western mines are starting to shut down. Why? Because of green energy. So our preferences for how we go in and consume our energy, not to mention the advent of new technologies like the wind turbines and so on and so forth, they are the ones that are actually going in and putting the coal mines out of business. Right? It's not just that we want to go in and consume less fossil fuels. We're going in and we have a lot more choices that technologically were not available before. By the way, if you were around this neck of the country 5-10 years ago, by now you would have seen 2 coal trains a day, right? Coming from the north. They were actually coming from the western part and coming down our line, and they were going down to the Sooner electric plant. Just south of Ponca City. The last time I saw a coal train go down through this area was probably 5 months ago, right? You just don't see it because the coal plant is idle right now. These wind turbines have almost completely taken away the need to have that coal-fired plant there, right? So the jobs, these coal mining jobs, despite what our current administration says, they're not coming back. I mean, it's as simple as that. They are not coming back. And technological change has gone in and made that particular industry obsolete. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, well, is that a good or a bad thing? And the answer is, well, yes. Now, if you're a West Virginia coal miner or even one out in, if you're a coal miner at all, this sucks, right? But if you're going in and you are us and you're wanting clean energy, you care about the environment, you want renewable energies and so on and so forth, well then, this sort of thing is simply going to happen in our economy. So there's been several bouts of structural unemployment in the United States. And this is something that everybody just has to deal with. All right, so there's a structural unemployment. All right, questions? All right, so next time what we're going to do is we now know that there are 3 types of unemployment. We now also know that we have a target goal of 4% unemployment. So the question is, what types of unemployment do we want to make up that 4%? And then we're going to look in general at the labor force next time and go in and see where the number for unemployment actually comes from. Is everybody good? All right, it's good to see you guys. Have a good day. We'll see everybody on Friday.
Doing really well.
You could say that, John.